Well, now, Hen Weaver was a bright man, but he had a retarded brother who actually lived in part of the fruit house. And that's been remodeled somewhat. It was originally just sort of a slab structure, but there was one window in it about where that air conditioner is, and there was a door next to it then, right there. Like I say, it's been completely remodeled. It's the same shape, the same size as it was then. But in that window, he had this little bird, which was with a beak on it, which was dipping down and getting water and then going back and forth. And it was a perpetual motion machine, which he had actually invented. And based on that, Daddy Klein, who started this private cemetery in 1914, took that principle and developed it into what is called the hydraulic ram. Now, the hydraulic ram uses the same principle. It gets water here, and then it tilts, and then when the water comes back here, it drains out, and then this end is heavy again and fills up with water, and then it tilts back and it lets out, and just continuous. Out in the Midwest, they had windmills to bring water up out of the ground to feed their livestock and themselves, but when there was no wind, they had no power whatsoever to bring if they had a well, they could hand pump, but they couldn't hand pump for a couple of hundred head of cattle. So when the hydraulic ram came along, that would work summer, winter. It didn't matter. You didn't need anything. It was down in the ground where it was warm enough to keep functioning at all times. And it was the thing that saved the American Midwest. And we have a picture of the demonstration of Daddy Klein's world's largest hydraulic ram. It was at the west end of town. And it's a pipe about this big around, and it's 60 feet in the air. And this hydraulic ram is pumping that much water all the way up 60 feet, and then it's pouring out. So it was and then he had a crew that went and installed the rams all over the country. But it came out of this idiot's mind. So he was an idiot, truly, and I'm not trying to denigrate the man, but he fits the description of an idiot, and yet he was able to develop this little toy, which turned out to be a very important thing. Many years later, there was a plastic company that came out with little birds that replicated what he was doing. At one point it was there, and there's another time it was on the second floor of the bank, but in here, that part was the tennis courts, and in those days, in 1906, 7, and 8, they had recess in high school. I mean, we had recess in grade school, but they had recess in high school, and the kids would go out and play tennis and have their little fun, exercise. And my grandmother was not a good tennis player, and everyone taunted her, Lily Kern, and they teased her, and so she quit school because she just couldn't take this teasing. And she often told me how it was a horrible time of her life. Later it became okay. But it's covered with, right now it's covered with vinyl, and underneath that was wood, and underneath that are logs, chestnut logs that thick. If you would see from the outside to the inside, it's about that thick. I know when we tried to remodel in 1954, 52, no, 53, they took these power saws, the carpenters, and they got about that deep into the chestnut logs and burned the motor out. Not only of one, but of two saws. So we gave up the idea of cutting a doorway through those logs. And I'll explain where they came from a little bit later. Now right here was the North Side School. It's approximately the same dimensions as the front part of my house. It was a log structure, and it had a wooden shingle roof, and it had one pot-bellied stove in the middle. Otherwise it was one big open room, and the stovepipe went up through the roof. And it was used as a school, as a church, and as a meeting house. And one evening, and for years and years, people said, it's haunted. The place is haunted. There are spooks there. And it was called the Spook House. And apparently someone from New Berlin got the word that people in Beavertown were jittery when they went into the spook house. It was the only place, public place they had to meet. There was no church or anything else back then yet. So, nor a school other than this. There was another small one down at the south side. But the guys from New Berlin took phosphorus and put it on their face and put it on their hands and came here when the building was crowded with people and stood outside the windows and went, "Hoo, hoo." And in the excitement to escape, they knocked over the pot-bellied stove, and it caught fire with some of the papers that the people sort of threw up, and it started a fire, and it burned the roof off. So now we had no meeting house, no school, no church. Well, my Kern family owned the land and the building, so they moved it down to my house. My house was the old spook house. Those logs are singed, or were, on the inside a little bit, but other than that, it's very substantial, very well put together. So they just moved it part by part down there, and then in its place, they built a bigger brick schoolhouse right here, which was called the Academy. The Academy, and there's references to it, in 1871 when the trains came into town, all of the business whistles blew and they saluted the train. There was a crowd of people welcoming this new era in Beavertown. And the newspaper reporter reported all this and said, now everything in Beavertown is on the go and on the rise if they can only get the Academy fixed. Because this Academy was a two-story brick building that would sway in the wind. It would sway in the wind. And then the kids would exaggerate the sway by marching up the steps in cadence. Boom, 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 boom. And one time, during an extremely high wind, the kids were marching upstairs, the thing starts to crack. And the teachers immediately recognized that a disaster was about to occur and evacuated the building just in time for the second floor to come crashing down to the first floor. Well, they salvaged the boards from the second floor out of the building and removed everything else. The boards, by the way, are my attic floor. The boards of the Academy are the floor in my attic where I'm presently living. They said, now we're going to build a building. Moses, we want you to build a building. And we don't want this to be one shabby thing that's, and he built this. And it's pretty much, while it was redesigned in 38 and again just a year or two ago, it's essentially, not a thing has changed. The roof was been repaired, but the bricks, the stone foundation, everything is as he built it in 1880, and it has been in continuous use since then, and it's a fortress. If there were attack by heavy weapons and mortars and that sort of thing, I'd want to be in this building above any other building in Beavertown, because it's a double brick, highly reinforced, substantial structure. And we're so glad to have it now as our community library, as a meeting room for different organizations in our town, and of course for our borough council offices and our borough council chamber. So this building is one of our precious commodities, and it's been recognized as such by the Snyder County, the Beavertown Library Advisory Committee, and others. Thank you all for coming on this beautiful day. I hope you learned something that will benefit you. Okay?
If only we could remember half of those dates and whatever you gave us saying.
Well, 1851 the church, 1880 the school and the old Lutheran church, 1867 for the building, and then later the demise of the old Bethesda church becoming the evangelical church. Of course, I don't know there are any other dates that I gave you, because the very first my great-great-grandfather gave all this land to have this part built up. What is interesting is this was the first sanctuary church ever in Beavertown, and the first graveyard, and it was a Union church. But then, when the, we'll call it evangelical church came along, they were invited to become part of our graveyard, and because it was known that if you build a church nearby, you can use this as your graveyard. That's why the Lutherans chose that site. And we call this the Three Sisters, because essentially they all joined together to form the Union Cemetery Association, which is still in existence. I don't know of too many other places that are as this small, that have three churches all in one location. But I guess that's going to be my final word for the day. Unless you have some questions, I'll certainly entertain some.
I have one. Where did this Mr. Spake make all his money to have all this land so he could give it all away?
No, it was my Kern
Spake.
family.
Okay.
Well, they were wealthy to begin with.
Well, where'd you get it?
Well, when my great-great-great-grandfather came over from Germany and
Okay.
saw black walnut trees here, he went back to Germany and said, this is a good place to come. And he formed an expedition and brought a whole group of people here. And in two steamer trunks, well, they weren't steamers in the sailboat days, but in two big cargoes, he had German Bibles. And when he came back here, there was a sufficient number of Pennsylvania Germans, by this time they were still real Germans, who didn't have Bibles, and he sold these Bibles at an enormous profit and bought up land. He owned the land from over where the bridge is being built at the Middle Creek up to where the high school is, down to the Maples. This is all Kern land from the sale of those Bibles. And then he had 12 children, and then he divided out the land to the different children, but essentially it still remained in the family. And Jim Etzler is still part of the Kern family also. He has been, where Jim Etzler's farm is, if you're familiar with the Etzler Butcher Shop, he lives in and the largest barn in Snyder County. It was built there in 1845. The Kerns, that has been in continuous use since 1799. And it still is. But Jim has no sons or any other relatives who want to continue the farm, so when his demise comes, they'll inherit it, but if they don't continue to farm it, it'll probably be sold, and then it'll get out of the family. But yeah, that was Johann, that was Jost Kern that came from Germany. Then he had three sons in a row, or three generations in a row, that were Henry Kern, Henry Kern, Henry Kern. And it was the first Henry Kern that donated all this land. Because they had more than they could use, and he was a very religious man. He wanted a church here in Beavertown. At that time, they were using the church in Beaver Springs, which is now the Christ Church. And he felt we should have our own sanctuary right here in Beavertown. So in 1850, he donated the land, and then the Reformed congregation got together. There was sufficient population, you see. As the population grew and as the wealth grew, churches sprang up. This was the only church for a few years. And when there was sufficient Lutherans to have their own church, they split out and built their own church, and the Reformed stayed here. But that's what happened. There were almost all of the churches in colonial America were joint churches. You'd have one congregation use it one Sunday and another congregation, because there weren't enough people and there wasn't enough money to pay for keeping two churches and all that sort of thing. They each had their own preacher. Okay, well listen, nice having you good folks along.